Hello and welcome to This Week in Global Development. My name is Adva Saldinger and I'm your host today. Joining me to discuss the latest in global development news are my colleagues, Elissa Miolene, a reporter based in Washington, D.C., and our deputy managing editor, Fiona Zublin. I wanted to turn to you first, Elissa, and to get some insight into a story that happened yesterday, which is kind of a traumatic situation with the Department of Government Efficiency and a small U.S. government agency working on development issues in Africa, the U.S. Africa Development Foundation. So tell us a little bit about what happened yesterday.
Yeah, so yesterday was a crazy day for this small, relative to US standards, aid agency. So the US African Development Foundation, also headquartered in DC, but kind of runs its own ship in terms of the work that it does. A lot of it is working on economic growth, catalyzing the African private sector. And they run on a budget of, I think, between 40 to 45 million. So again, small in terms of US standards. So on February 19th, President Trump came out with an executive order for USADF and a few other agencies, one domestic and two others that focus on international work, one of which was a nonprofit. So that's kind of a little bit more complicated, the U.S. Institute of Peace. But let's focus on USADF for now. But essentially, this executive order said that within 14 days, the agencies needed to report back with how many staff, essentially, is my read of it, and how many programs and operations they needed to remain legally. And so a lot of folks in these agencies were working on plans for reductions in workforce, kind of looking to comply with the executive order to keep themselves as small as possible. But before those 14 days were up, the staff from DOGE, which included a couple of folks in their early 20s, this has been kind of all over the news with these DOGE folks all around town, kind of making massive changes, and Peter Morocco, who our readers will know by now as the head of the State Department's Office of Foreign Assistance, and then also the deputy acting for USAID. They came to USADF, tried to get in, were ultimately blocked from entry because the staff there were so terrified that once they did get in, they would start dismantling the systems, they would cancel all the contracts, they would cancel all the awards, and they would fire all the staff. And we're hearing that a similar situation played out earlier this week for another one of those agencies that were included in the executive order. So that was kind of a little take on what happened. They ultimately threatened coming back with federal marshals and with Secret Service if they did not open the door, and they did not return by the end of the day. So it's unclear what will happen today. I'm sure those staff are on the edge of their seats waiting to see if DOGE folks return and what will happen if they do and bring reinforcements.
And my understanding is that another piece of this story is that essentially the board of USADF was removed, and Peter Morocco was named as a board member and as sort of the head of the board of USADF, which is actually a position that has to be nominated and confirmed by the Senate. And that was sort of at the center of some of these conflicts because USADF is not under the auspices per se of the State Department, but an independent agency that responds to Congress. So I think that was at the crux of part of this conflict. And one of the things that I'm hearing is that essentially the administration is trying to reduce these agencies to the very bare minimum, right? That's what that executive order said. They are statutorily required to keep these agencies because Congress created them as independent agencies. But what does that mean? Does that mean we see a reduction to, one staff member and 2 grants? And does that meet the bar of what's required to sort of legally still be an entity? So lots to watch there. But that's definitely not the only thing that is happening in this sort of broader realm. There are a lot of lawsuits that are ongoing. And one of the big decisions that we had been waiting for was to see what the Supreme Court would decide after the government appealed a decision in the case that's been brought by some of the big nonprofit and for-profit implementers of USAID programs. So Elissa, can you give us an update on sort of what we saw in terms of from the Supreme Court decision, what we saw in some of those filings in the last few days?
Yeah, so NGO and for-profit contractors saw a bit of a win this week. The Supreme Court rejected the Trump administration to try to not pay about $2 billion in foreign assistance to USAID and State Department partners. This was something that was a little unexpected, to be honest, because the Supreme Court does have a majority of conservative justices, and the ruling, to be clear, was slim. It was 5-4. So the Supreme Court essentially told the Trump administration that it will have to pay, but it did not give a sense for exactly when or exactly how that payment will occur. Really, what it did was it handed the case back down to the district court, which is where it has been ongoing. And actually, several of us will be headed to the courtroom today to get a sense for, okay, what's next in this ruling. This was kind of a crazy, again, back and forth with this time legal drama in terms of a district court judge saying, again, last month, that the Trump administration had to pay up. Then, seeing no evidence that they had done that, the district court judge said, okay, you must do it within 30 hours or some such. And then in that 30 hours, the Trump administration canceled 10,000 contracts and also appealed to the Supreme Court. And that's kind of how we got to where we are today. So now it's really up in the air. What will happen? People are, I think that I've spoken to, happy that at least the Supreme Court did reject this attempt to not pay. But I think there's a lot of trust that's been eroded throughout this process. Whether or not the government will see that money come, whether or not the government will have that money flowing to its partners is unclear, especially because of so many canceled awards. We've heard about organizations getting terminations for all sorts of things, including many of them that were for life-saving assistance that had already been exempted by the State Department. And some organizations getting cancellations for other organizations. And then to bring it one step further, some organizations getting cancellations for those cancellations. So it's a total, mess in terms of like where these awards stand, if the government will pay back, if they'll reverse these cancellations. So we'll see, and we'll be tracking what will happen today.
Fiona, I wanted to turn to you because we had a story this week from our colleague Colin Lynch, which is sort of looking at a specific case of some of this chaos and the implications of what's going to happen, particularly looking at the faith-based community, which is, a lot of people thought would see, continued support and continue to be implementers, but we're seeing a lot of them, in fact, be just as hard hit by a lot of these cancellations. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're sort of seeing on the faith-based front?
Yeah, so Column's reporting indicates that that World Vision, this evangelical-based NGO, may see as many as 3,000 people laid off. It might not be that much because, as Elissa mentioned, I mean, we are getting cancellations to cancellations, so it is not at all clear that like all of the programs that have been canceled will stay canceled. But there was a meeting, I believe, on Friday with Pete Morocco speaking to faith-based groups and just being told that there is no appetite for foreign aid, no matter who is administering it, from the president or from the American people, which there has been some recent polling about that indicates that may not be entirely true, but certainly the president has no appetite for foreign aid in its current incarnation. But yeah, it does seem that while there was some hope from these faith-based organizations that they would get a bit more humane treatment for their awards because of their connections to the president and his party, it seems like that's not happening.
Yeah, I wanted to just add one quick thing. I think there's a tremendous amount of chaos, right? And I think one of the things that's coming out is, we saw in court filings that the administration said that the review period is over, right? That's why these terminations came. They said they were all individually reviewed by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, which a lot of people have questioned just based on the volume of the terminations that went out. And then one of the things that struck me, Pete Morocco met in a closed door session with members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday. And what I'm being told that sort of happened at that meeting is he said that the review is actually still ongoing. So we're in fact even getting conflicting information from the government about whether the review is ongoing, what is sort of happening there. He was asked about payments, and he said the payment process is very complicated, and that they have to kind of go line by line and make sure that there's nothing that shouldn't be funded. So again, I mean, I think, one of the things we heard in sort of a readout of that faith-based meeting was, not a lot of clarity about what happens moving forward. And I think the same thing was reflected at the sort of closed door session yesterday. There were questions raised about the waiver process not working properly, including by Republican members of Congress. And the response to that was that there's sort of this, overzealous due diligence, either on the part of USAID employees or on NGOs, and that they should be implementing the programs, the waivers should be working. And we've heard this from the administration in the past. We've heard this from some members of Congress. I think the reality is that if the payment issues aren't sorted out, people can't implement programs without the money. And that's certainly what we're seeing, and part of why the waivers haven't worked. So I think there's remains a lot of questions about what exactly is going to happen. And, we would be remiss if we only talked about the US, because there is some pretty major news from across the pond in this last week, and one that I think took a lot of people by surprise, and that is the UK government announcing that it would pretty dramatically reduce its aid budget. And so,
Yeah.
Fiona, can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Sure. Well, probably anyone who's been sort of in the aid sector for a while will remember the 2021 UK aid cuts, which just like, I hate to use the word decimated because it was reduced by way more than 1/10, but really affected the UK aid sector. And that was proportionally a smaller cut than what was announced last week. So this is from 0.5% of gross national income to 0.3%. So it's a 40% cut, although that's a little bit wibbly because you never know what gross national income is going to be in any given year. So, but that's a lot. So it's meant to take effect in 2027, which could mean that we see a really different rollout of those cuts. Because one of the hallmarks of the UK aid cuts that started in 2021 was first they happened pretty much right away. There was a real lack of transparency. People didn't know if the work that they were doing was funded or not. I mean, as we've seen with the US aid cuts, a lack of transparency is like part of what makes it so traumatic and difficult. And I think that there is at least like some hope in the sector that with more time to prepare and more transparency about what they can actually expect, it may not be as difficult. Another factor that's really specific to the UK is that the UK spends an enormous amount of money on in-donor refugee costs. So on taking care of refugees who are in their first year within the country. And this is something that can be counted as development assistance for the first year that someone is in the country, but it doesn't have to be. And the UK aid budget has been over and over kind of rated by the Home Office and by these in-donor costs to the tune of about 28% of the budget. So if they're able to, as the aid department, since the election has promised to get a handle on those costs, have those costs come from somewhere else, then it could go a long way toward making up that shortfall of 40%. Not all the way, but a long way. But if they continue to spend that much money on in-donor refugee costs, then it means the aid budget will be even smaller than it looks right now.
And this was after the government sort of had said they would actually increase the aid budget, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what created a shock. And then the other thing we saw is actually turnover in the leadership, right?
Absolutely.
And so can you tell us a little bit about what happened there and what we know about the new minister who's going to be in charge of aid?
Yeah. So in response to the aid cuts, the Minister for Development resigned, Annalise Dodds. She's a member of parliament. And she specifically said, so I believe the cuts were announced on Tuesday of last week, and she resigned on Friday, telling the Prime Minister in a letter that she also posted on X that she had understood that there would, because the whole reason for these aid cuts, announced reason for these aid cuts, is that they need the money to increase defense spending to defend against Russia and to help support Ukraine now that the US has telegraphed that it may not be as supportive of Ukraine. And we've seen that from other European governments over the past week, promising an increase in military spending. And Annalise Dodds wrote to the prime minister that she understood that military spending needed to increase, but that the whole burden of that had been placed on the development budget. And of course, a lot of people in the development community would argue that development is also a national security expense, and that having a development budget goes a long way toward making a nation more secure. But so she resigned and was replaced by Baroness Jenny Chapman, who is a member of the House of Lords. She used to be an MP, but she lost her seat about 6 years ago. And she's very close to the prime minister. She was his political secretary for a few years. And she's now in the House of Lords, which is significant because it means that apparently she will have less sort of accountability to the public because she's not in the House of Commons. She won't be on the House floor. The House of Lords is often seen as like a bit more removed from like public accountability and public opinion. And if you are an MP in the House of Commons, the people have a lot more sway, if only because they can vote for you, whereas in the House of Lords, you're just there, you know. So this is a factor, and it's something that a lot of UK NGOs have spoken about, released statements about, saying, we're really concerned that a person with no development background is in this role. But it's possible that, she'll be able to take up the mantle and fight for ODA, fight for things like getting these refugee costs out of the development budget, but it's just not clear yet.
Do we have any sense of, how the UK might prioritize the smaller aid budget? Will we see, more of a focus on humanitarian aid? What do we have any sense yet, or is it too early?
It's not really clear yet. And it's going to be quite difficult because there has already been so much shaving out of the budget over the last few years anyway. There's a really interesting analysis, I believe it was from the Center for Global Development, where they looked at sort of in the 2021 cuts, how programs were cut based on merit, based on ratings of how that program had performed. And that in that case, they even had to cut programs that were good, programs that were working. It wasn't about trimming programs that had failed or that weren't performing their function. It was about cutting out things that were quite important even. So with this much smaller budget, I would expect there would probably be a stronger focus on basic humanitarian stuff. But it's unclear so far.
Yeah, I've certainly heard some concerns about what impact that will have on climate finance in particular, right? If that's gets hard hit in this decision. I did have an opportunity to sit down last week with the new CEO of British International Investment, which is the development finance institution of the UK. And I did actually ask him how the aid cuts might impact BII. And he said, at this point, BII is pretty well capitalized. It doesn't actually need an influx of money from the government, in part because they've gotten a lot of money in recent years, which has been controversial in some aid circles. But that interview will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, and I think it'll be interesting to see how his vision shapes how it shapes BII. And I think that development finance institutions and also sort of the broader ecosystem of local public development banks, of multilateral development banks, in this new era where we're really seeing across the board significant reductions to official development assistance, will play a bigger role in the development finance landscape. And that's a lot of what I was reporting on last week at the Finance and Commons Summit. That was sort of the real subtext is, what's next? How does this system adapt and transform? And some of that may mean more locally led development. Some of these local development banks, I met the head of the Public Development Bank of Nigeria, for example, doing really interesting work to fund small and medium enterprises in the country. So how do you make sure that they are accessing the funds they need so that they can help build local economies? Because I think especially that sort of economic development piece, as these aid budgets are, constrained, those programs I think are at risk in some ways. Though it certainly in Europe, we've seen in some cases a doubling down on sort of these economic development projects that have a benefit not only for the country that's getting the investment, but for the Europeans. And I think we could also see that sort of transactional nature in the US, once whatever emerges, I think we have seen a little bit more emphasis on the US Development Finance Corporation, though it hasn't been sort of free from some of the staffing cuts that we've seen elsewhere as well. Elissa, is there anything else that sort of we're looking out for in the next couple of days? I know you said there's a hearing coming up today in the one lawsuit. I know that we're expecting a decision on a temporary restraining order in the lawsuit brought by personal services contractors. I was at the hearing held in that case yesterday, and the judge wanted another day or two to consider his ruling. What else are you sort of tracking, or what might we expect moving forward in terms of what's happening at USAID?
Yeah, I mean, I think Adva, you said the biggest kind of movements and things that we're tracking. I think the other thing that we're tracking is just, again, the ripple effects of all of this. So at this point, we've looked at a number of different kind of sectors and different organizations about, okay, what does this all mean across the world, not just here in DC? My colleague Tanya Karas and I looked specifically yesterday at nutrition, and again, looking at this flip-flop of, okay, these massive US-based, they're actually nonprofits, but they're working to create RETS, which is the peanut paste that kids use when they're starving, and doctors can help them get back on track with this highly fortified peanut paste. That was canceled, and then it was uncanceled. And then we kind of looked deeper at, okay, even with this reversal, what about actually getting that peanut paste to the kids? Well, everything else within that supply chain is broken. So I think we're continuing to track at Devex a number of different, ripple effects for organizations, for sectors. I know our global health colleagues have done quite a bit of that work too, in terms of looking at a lot of this life-saving medication and aid that's continuing to not be delivered to the folks that need it. And then it just, it's funny. I think every day I have woken up and not known what will come. The USADF news of yesterday was a complete surprise. So who knows what we'll be talking about next week at This Week in Global Development, and we'll just be here to track it all, or try our best anyway.
Yeah, I did want to shout out a piece from our colleague Jenny Lee Ravello, who really wrote about some of the global health impacts this week. I'd recommend that people check out that piece. We also had a piece about sort of the Chinese government stepping up to fill some of the holes left with US pulling out of aid projects. And so that's a piece that I would also recommend that people check out. And I think with that, we can close this week. I'm sure there'll be plenty more to talk about next week. Elissa, Fiona, thank you so much for joining me. And that was This Week in Global Development.